So welcome. As I was just introduced, my name is Andrew Humphreys. I work for Gartner. If you're not familiar with what Gartner is, it's basically an analyst company. So it's not like we're kind of like all geniuses or anything. What we're trying to do in Gartner is we're trying to analyze what's happening across the industry. So we talk to hundreds and hundreds of different clients, we talk to the vendors quite regularly in order to try and understand what's actually happening, and then we try and kind of feed that back to clients to help them be successful in their projects and so forth. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about here is kind of based on what we have seen happening, in particular across like integration and APIs, and sort of the things that we're observing that you probably would want to be aware of, to try and understand like, how are you approaching integration, how are you approaching APIs? Is your strategy going to deliver on the results you have in mind? That's really the sort of key message I want to come across. And I'll start with this picture of Las Vegas. And the reason I start with this picture of Las Vegas is if you work in the IT industry, it's likely at some point you're going to end up having to go to some kind of conference in Las Vegas. There always seems to be a conference going on there related to IT. So I think I've been there pretty much like every year for the last 25 years. But the thing about Las Vegas, if you think about its purpose, it's very much set up to run conferences. It's set up for other things as well, but one of its value comes from running conferences. But every time you go back there, it's different. You know, they've knocked down like kind of 2 or 3 hotels and built new ones. And I think that's a good way of thinking about like kind of the way that you need to think about your integration strategy. Is that you can't be static. You have to be constantly prepared to change. You've got to respond to and improve on the things that are happening. Now, when I very first got into integration, before I worked at Gartner, I worked for IBM for a long time. One of my first managers I had there when I started the integration practice, he said to me that it's a good thing to get into integration because integration is very similar to hairdressing. And the reason he said it's very similar to hairdressing is because you always need it. Personally, not so much. But for a lot of other people, whatever you're trying to achieve, you still need to go back. You still need to go back and you revisit things and learn what you're doing again. Because in the same way that you constantly need to have a haircut, integration is constantly changing. And the reason why this is important is if you think about what integration actually does. Now, anything you wanted to achieve, if you wanted to fit together like something like a customer 360-degree view, or you wanted to start building new digital apps, or you started adopting like SaaS applications, and you need to connect them to the rest of the business, what actually critically determines the success of what you're doing is integration. So if you do it badly, your project will fail. So you need to be aware and continue to think about how you're going to approach integration and how you're going to make it successful. And that's reflected if we look at like some of the things. This is from a Gartner survey. So one of the other things that Gartner is very big on is to do surveys and analysis and understand what's happening in the world. And one of the things that we did was we asked last year, we asked like a bunch of CIOs, what are the things you're thinking about increasing investment in? What IT things are you increasing investment in? And you'll see on here that, not formatted very well on here, but the 5th most important thing is actually about APIs and integration architecture. It does say that, I promise. But actually, if you look at what the other things are saying, you can't do any of them without integration either. Because what they're saying is, well, actually, we're investing in digital business and transformation, or we're adopting cloud, or we're trying to do like business intelligence. All of these require integration as well. So although integration shows as 5th, which is kind of important, it's actually critical to everything that you want to do. Everything you want to achieve in your industry is underpinned by integration. So what is it? If we say that things are changing, if there's a constant sense of change within the industry and you need to be responding to those changes, what are the things that you need to think about? And another piece of research that Gartner produces is called a hype cycle. And what a hype cycle is trying to do is it's trying to look at what are the things that are happening in the industry, and what it's trying to show is basically that things come off as an interesting idea, people get very excited about them, then there tends to be like, oh, it didn't actually deliver quite what I expected, but then it eventually kind of settles down and it's delivering on success. And what I'm trying to show here is these are the sort of things that we see happening. These are the things that we're going to be talking to us about as are happening as relevant to the integration market. But maybe it's a little bit complicated to see, so I tried to summarize it down a bit by looking at, like, in my experience and the experience of people in my team, what are the sort of things that people are asking us about? What are the things that people, like kind of yourselves and people in industries all around the world are concerned about? What they come and talk to Gartner because they want like advice here. And it really boils down to these 3 things. So about APIs, they're asking about event-driven architecture,
And I'm also asking about how can we support any kind of digital and automation initiative. And the thing I kind of conclude from looking at this chart is actually they're all really about the same thing. It's really what the goal is at the moment is to increase adaptability. It's increase flexibility of what we're trying to achieve. So instead of like kind of we think about integration as a traditional goal as being about, well, I actually got a bunch of systems of record and I want to keep them in lock with each other. And change is very slow. That isn't the world we're in today. What we want to be now is much more flexible, much more adaptable, because we want to be on a more composable business in order to deliver on more flexibility in business goals. And in order to do this, we need to think about how we're approaching integration. We need to think about how we're approaching API, what technologies we're using to do that. And critically, we need to think about our integration strategy. But how are we approaching integration challenges? Are they going to give us this flexibility that we need? So let's dive into a bit about what we're saying around like kind of APIs, event-driven architecture, and those kind of topics. And the first thing is, I think everyone in this room is probably aware of both this kind of quote on the left here as you're looking at it, or sorry, right here as you're looking at it, which is from Jeff Bezos from Amazon, quite a while ago now, basically saying that everything in his company must be API-driven. Everything in Bezos must be API-driven. And a lot of the thought process is around, well, APIs are the common way that we're going to make ourselves more adaptable and more responsive. It's also a way to make more money. It's also a way to open up new business opportunities. So I can actually expose functions of business as an API. I can actually sell it. I can monetize it. There's another key goal around that. And the critical point here is at the end is, if this is the path we want to go down, it will make us more efficient if we allocate the right focus and resources to it. So this is kind of, I'm not saying this is my like kind of recommendation. I'm saying this is the things that people are saying about APIs. This is what's driving a lot of the sort of interest and attention in APIs in general. That like kind of a different survey did, another survey Gartner did. I said Gartner is big on surveys. This is about what's actually happening. How many people are actually using APIs? And if you can actually see, it's actually pretty much now ubiquitous. It's like 94% are already using, and another 4% internal APIs. And actually, it's still way over 50% in terms of like using APIs or providing APIs to third parties, using third-party APIs, using public APIs in our space. Just as an observation, it's actually much more common in Europe to use third-party APIs than it is anywhere else in the world. We're kind of ahead of the rest of the world in this point. But also, I think it's interesting to look at the trends. So we look at kind of the adoption of API technology and so forth, and we can see what's happening over the last sort of 3 years. You see it's actually continuing to go up. Like internal APIs were already high, they've gone up even higher, but a lot of the other uses of API are continuing to grow. So this kind of tells us that there is huge growth in the use of APIs. So the critical point is, how do you do that? How do you make it successful? How are you going to ensure that you don't just kind of adopt APIs badly? Because doing it badly will lead to problems of its own. So let's think about the sort of thought about event-driven architecture. Now, if you were particularly eagle-eyed when I put up the height chart, you would have seen that event-driven architecture was right at the peak of expectation. It was right at the highest point of what we consider to be hype. Which, if you think about it, is actually a little bit odd, because there's nothing particularly new about event-driven architectures. Like, if you think about things like IBM MQ as a technology, it's existed for like 30, 40 years as a mechanism of connecting applications together. So what is it that's actually driving renewed interest in event-driven architectures? And really, I think what really underpins it is the demand for digital applications, demand for composable applications, actually uncovers new use cases and new requirements, and they're driving the interest in event-driven architecture. Because if we think about like kind of any kind of digital application, and the sort of interaction that you want to have with that digital application. Like, let's say like it's like a mobile phone app for an airline or something like that. Now, some of those interactions are very obviously API-based. So anything I want to initiate from the mobile app is very suitable to using an API. So it's something like I want to use the mobile app to book a ticket. Or I want to use a mobile app to reserve a seat. That's something that's very much an API call. I call the airline and basically complete that transaction. If I want to compete, in the market, if I want to build an application that is genuinely usable, there's actually another type of interaction that I want to have, which is where the airline is pushing the information to me. And that's things like the sort of simple information like, oh, there's a delay in the flight, or we have to change the gate from which it's departing on. And then what the airline wants to do is they want to publish that information to a smaller subset of people who are interested in that flight. So who's the people on that flight? Those are the ones who need to get that information. And I want that pushed to me. I don't want the mobile app to have to constantly poll in order to receive that information. So that's just to illustrate that there is a requirement for event-driven communication to support digital applications. So that's one reason that we're seeing this growth. Another reason we're seeing this growth, if you go back and think about like the original use case that event-driven architecture was trying to solve, it was really about decoupling. It was about taking like two applications that needed to communicate together and ensuring they were too tightly timed. So using a queue as a mechanism in the middle. But then if you think about like kind of what we're trying to achieve with microservices, that is also about achieving isolation of different components. So it's like I want to keep components separate. I want to break up large monolithical applications, and therefore I then will be able to scale things independently. I'll be able to kind of deploy things in more fine-grained units. But if you then use some kind of synchronous communication between those two components, you then have a problem in that you're not going to be able to scale. So if I can do things like add more processors, more instances of the things that are processing the message at the back end, without having to change anything at the front end, I get a much more flexible and decoupled architecture. So one of the other reasons that we're seeing this like kind of revival of event-driven communication is because it actually helps with the delivery of microservices architecture. And microservices architecture is obviously a key thing which is driving like new application development. And you can take that story a little bit further. If you think about, I'm trying to build a bunch of digital applications which need to get information from my back-end systems of record. And my back-end systems of record typically are not built to cope with receiving thousands and thousands of requests for thousands of mobile devices calling them at the back end. So what we see event-driven communication doing is allowing the systems of record to just publish when something changes, publish a change in their status, which can then be pushed to any digital application that's interested in it. And that actually leads to the thought of another thing you would see on the hype cycle that you've been particularly paying attention, which is this concept of a digital integration hub. And the concept here is that you have a bunch of like kind of multi-user, multi-experience applications at the front end, which are probably talking via APIs, but they're talking to what we would call a digital integration hub. The digital integration hub holds all of the data that the front end applications are interested in. And the best practice way of updating the digital integration hub is to use like kind of event-driven architecture, or to use kind of a messaging-based approach, such that any change in the back-end system is pushed into the digital integration hub. And then you protect the back-ends, they're no longer getting all of the workload, all of the requests directly, and you also keep in sync this kind of centralized bliss. So those are just some of the things that we've seen, some of the sort of architectural, application architecture things of why we've seen a revival about event-driven architecture in the integration space. The other big one, of course, is that there's kind of a big push to get more insights, more understanding, and do more analytics on data. And using event-driven architecture is a very good way of feeding any kind of analytics engine. So you can have whatever kind of information is generating some kind of event, go and feed into an analytics engine. And you see that both like statically, like this, or you see it as kind of like a loop type thing where you're actually responding to events in real time. You're detecting something is happening, and you're then expecting something to happen. And event-driven architecture is underpinning that. So those are some of the things that we're seeing happening. Those are some of the things in the industry which are driving some kind of change. So let's think now about what are the problems we have. What are the problems we see with traditional integration architectures that stop us achieving those things that we want to do, stop us achieving the agility that we need, stop us achieving like kind of the new use cases that we want to do. I'm basically going to talk about like 4 different things that are impacting on integration managing. The first one is like it doesn't really support those new use cases. So I'm talking about the different use cases of event-driven architecture to make you think, well, are we actually able to support that today? Second point is about, if you think about that, how integration is traditionally structured. It's very much focused on specialists doing delivery. And that makes it very difficult to scale. I'm going to talk a little bit about more in a moment. Third point is, right, how do you want to deploy it? How do you want to run your integrations and so forth? And how are they going to provide the flexibility you need to support the business? And the final point is, like, a traditional integration architecture, very limited observability, very little problem determination built into it. Makes it very hard to take advantage of the data and solve those analytic use cases that I was just talking about. So let's dive into a bit more of what we mean about these points. And if you think about like kind of the domain of integration and what you need to think about in the integration world, you think back probably 15 years, 20 years, it was quite a simple problem in some ways, in that what you were trying to do was connect back-end systems together. And they were all running within your own data center. The breadth that you had to think about was relatively simple. I could go and talk to the person who ran the system that was running code that I wanted to connect to. But if you think about the world today, it's no longer like that. Like just within my kind of own data center, I'll be now using SaaS applications, and I'll be using public cloud and making API calls, and I might be moving some things to private cloud. And actually, I can extend this even beyond the kind of what is kind of owned by my own enterprise into what's owned by the whole integration domain. And I'm going to start doing things like APIs that I'm exposing to customers, or apps that I want customers to use, or business partners and so on, and integration devices and so forth. And that means the kind of the landscape that I need to think about for integration has greatly expanded. So I need to think about, well, how can I cope with these new endpoints, these new types of use cases and so forth. What I would make is around who actually is involved in building and delivering integration. And traditionally, this is the role of an integration specialist. Now, this is kind of, to be fair, this is the role that I've had for a long time. It's like the person in the organization who's responsible for everything to do with integration, right? They build everything, they own everything. But if you think about that kind of person, what that creates, if you think about like the world today, they're no longer the only people that you want building integration. We'll talk about some of the reasons for that in a moment. But if you think about there are other people in the organization who are interested in building integration. So there's people who are developers building their own applications. They don't want to go and talk to the integration team. They want to be empowered to build their own integrations. Or there's people who administer SaaS applications and they're charged with how do I integrate the SaaS application easily into my backend system. Or there's people who are sat literally in the line of business, maybe not describe what they're having as an integration challenge at all, but they think along things of, oh, it'd be great if I could automate more things. It would be great if instead of having to like kind of manually copy out of a spreadsheet and write it into Salesforce, I could automate that experience. And the integration kind of people involved today needs to expand to include these groups. And this is a value to the companies to think about how to empower them, because typically there's more innovation happening in those areas. The people working in those areas are typically more innovative, revolving more on the kind of more exciting leading edge projects than the people who are integration specialists. There's another way of thinking about this as well, which is if you think about like kind of all the integrations that you could possibly build, or all the APIs that you could possibly build in the organization, you could rank them by like how complex it is to actually build them, and also kind of think about the business benefit that you will get them. Now, if you have a very small team, a very specialist team, who concentrates on building all the integration with APIs, the likelihood is they are going to deliver those things which are of the highest business value, which are likely also of the highest business complexity. The trouble is then, there's still a huge amount of things which you could deliver. There's still a huge amount of other things which are of value to business. If you carry on over here, if you carry on probably, out the door here and carry on for miles, of things that we could do, which would be useful if only we had a way to deliver them. So one of the other kind of thought process here is you need to find a way to get more people able to build and contribute integrations. So it's like, how can we make applications teams more able to build their own integrations? How can we make wider business teams more able to build their own APIs and integrations? Because they're still going to deliver business value. They're still going to improve the overall business. So by democratizing the whole process of building and integrations and APIs, you're going to deliver more for the business. So that's another challenge we see, is how can the organizations move from this sort of centralized approach to a more democratized approach. The next kind of issue we see with traditional integration is to do with how it's deployed. Now, if you think about like kind of a traditional integration deployment, it was typically very centralized, and that reflected the kind of technology that was about when integration teams were first set up. It'd be a very centralized EFB, probably running in like kind of a couple of integration servers, and they would be very tightly controlled. But that doesn't match the way that people want to deploy things today. If you think about what people want to do today, they want to go in either one of two directions, or well, at least one of two directions. They either want to move everything kind of to the cloud, they want to outsource it, they don't want to have to have responsibility for running it, or if they do want to run it, they want to do what they're doing with applications, and they want to break things down to be more microservice-like, more running in containers. But it's important that this also extends to how you think about integration and how you would deliver that. Because you can look for, I need to move my technology from a traditional integration runtime to container-based runtime, and they're going to get all the same benefits of that for integration that you get for applications. So easier scalability, easier to manage, easier to kind of isolate and control. And we're seeing that evolution happening all the time. We're seeing integration software vendors move to offering cloud solutions, moving to offering containerized solutions. And we're also saying like the start of that like evolving again to be serverless. And actually, if you think about like integration, think about the concept of integration or the concept of an API, it actually matches quite well the deployment pattern of container or even serverless. Because every single integration that you create is actually like its own little black box. Anyway, it's its own container that it doesn't typically interact, apart from via standardized interface, with anything else. So it actually matches quite well the deployment architecture. It only really has this traditional deployment because that's what the technology required at the time. And so I think like it shows like you actually get probably a lot of benefit from looking at how integration deployment can move and evolve. The final point to observe here on like kind of problems is that integration is traditionally to blame for everything that goes wrong within an organization. Because and part of the reason for that is nobody can see what's actually happening. Oh, I set that request and never got a response back. It must be the integration layer that got lost. It got lost in. And that's part of the kind of challenge of traditional integration architectures, is that you don't get enough observability. You don't see what's happening. You can't tie it into your kind of AI ops and sort of things, or even then expand that into analytics engines and business insights. And all of these things really kind of come back to, these are the challenges we're seeing across the industry. These are the problems we see in traditional architectures. The four things I've talked about are things that you would want to address in order to deliver that flexibility and composability into your organization. So the next question really is, well, how can you go about doing that? How can you achieve that? And we kind of, with Gartner, we've kind of looked at like what people are doing. And we think that you need to think about your maturity as an organization to how you approach integration. And you need to think about that maturity in these kind of 5 dimensions. So it's like, what is your overall strategy? What are you trying to achieve? And who owns responsibility for integration? Who owns responsibility for APIs? Who's responsible for building those things? What technology do you use and how do you intend to operate it? And we put together like a model of that, which talks about like kind of the stages that you can go through and what you're trying to achieve. And this is like quite a lot of words on this chart, so I don't expect you to read this in any great depth. So I simplified it down to basically this, which is think about how you approach integration and APIs in your organization. Where do you fit in this kind of in this model, and where do you want to get to? So I'm not saying everybody needs to get to the business utility phase on the right here, but you do need to get there if you want to get the kind of increased composability and all the things we talked about at the beginning. But typically we see kind of organizations are probably more likely in the ad hoc or enlightened stage. So they don't particularly think about integration, or they approach each challenge ad hoc. Or quite often they do recognize integration and they have like a centralized team. They have that team that I talked about earlier who is responsible for all integration within the organization. And that team has probably existed for a long time and has a set of tools and frameworks and do things the way they do things because that's how they already done it. And what we're trying to kind of encourage people to do is to move to be more democratized, to move to more self-service, get the advantage of enabling more people to build integrations, and break this kind of siloed mentality that all integration, all APIs come from a single team within the organization. Because that limits your ability to be able to be innovative. It limits your ability to get more people involved and therefore get value from kind of team building and so forth. So if we think about what we're trying to achieve, a lot of companies today will have like a central integration competency center. They think about the goal that they want to get to. They want to kind of get rid of that team and have integration kind of owned by all of the different teams. Now, a critical point here is you still need a team which is like kind of the integration platform team. And they're doing kind of all of the sort of business critical integration that needs to be done, in particular things which cross the domains. So if you know, like HR, finance, and mobile all have to access, say, SAP at the back end, that integration platform team is responsible for. But you've got to empower the HR team to build their own integration, do their own innovation there as well. So in order to make that successful, in order to make that not what we saw as the sort of ad hoc days where it's just a wild west, everybody does whatever they want with integration, what we see as an emerging organisation structure is what we call an integration strategy empowerment team, which sits above all of these things. If you think about what an integration strategy empowerment team is about, it's basically about how can we enable people to go and approach building integrations and make it easy for them and think about what they need, but still contain like a level of control. So it's not just everybody doing ad hoc, doing the same things differently all the time. And we see an ISET integration strategy enablement team is responsible for owning the overall integration strategy, but also for understanding, well, what kind of technology should we use? What best practice should we apply? How can we provide support services to all those different people who want to go and build integrations? And this is the way that we see of like being able to introduce that flexibility, introduce that composability without losing complete control, without going back like 15 years back to where everything was just kind of out of control. So what is it that that team needs to think about? Well, it needs to think about addressing kind of a diverse set of requirements. So some of them are quite obvious. It needs to think about, well, what things do I need to integrate with? What things are I trying to connect together? And how do I want to do it? What processes do I want to support and so forth? But it also needs to think about, well, who are the people involved in building those integrations and what kind of skills and experiences do they have and what kind of support will they need, as well as where do we want it to run? What kind of reasons do we have and where do we want to run it for operational purposes and so on? And the reason they need to think about these things is they need to think about what technology to use to solve the integration challenges that they're facing. One of the things that comes up a lot when we talk to clients is, well, is there a tool I can buy that solves all of my API and integration challenges? And the answer to that is, well, no, not really, because it's a bit like this illustration here. It's a bit like, well, okay, you can buy a penknife, but a penknife isn't what you would see a builder use to go do genuine kind of construction work, because the tools have more specialist needs. And if you think about it like that, just in the examples I gave earlier of like kind of APIs and event-driven architecture, if you think about event architecture technologies, you can think broadly, there's two very clear categories of technology. The bottom one is log-oriented. This is like Kafka. So I bet everyone in the room has heard of Kafka as a technology, where basically what you're trying to do is everything at the back end kind of publishes changed information, publishes that something has changed, and that gets written into a log, which never changes. So that log is like immutable, and you can see the history of it. And then a variable and constantly changing number of subscribers can retrieve that information at any point to understand what happened, what changed in the particular system. That's a very different architectural model from what has been the sort of traditional event-driven model, which is queue-based. The queue-based is really, I want to send an instruction to another application. So it's like, I want to tell application A to make this update. And that kind of model requires a very different technology than is used for log-oriented. They're both valid use cases. They're both valid things that you're likely to want to do in an enterprise. Think about like kind of all of the different things you might want to sort of think about in terms of enterprise messaging. But I can't solve all of those different use cases using just one product. I'm likely to need multiple different technologies in my architecture to solve that particular challenge. Similarly, if we think about like kind of APIs and API management, now anybody who's looking at like kind of doing APIs is aware that they're going to need some kind of like management platform for those APIs. They're going to need some kind of API lifecycle tooling. And traditionally, this is provided in a single platform. So we get a single technology which provides you a gateway, a portal in order to go and find APIs. It can provide some kind of analytics, some kind of control of the lifecycle. It might do other things as well, but it's providing that technology. But that's not actually what we're seeing happening in the industry today. We're actually seeing these components being broken out from being a single vendor. We're seeing it happening with portals. We're seeing like products, vendors emerge who are very focused on providing like kind of portal support and also gateways. If you think about like kind of the evolution of gateways, they started traditionally as kind of probably like HTTP gateways or server gateways, and they grew more technologies until they become this kind of gateway-saurus approach. We're actually seeing that kind of going away now to people having a big honking gateway. People wanting to support multiple different gateways, multiple different lightweight gateways in the organization. So again, really, both of these kind of last couple of points we illustrate there's an explosion in the amount of technologies you need to think about. There's an explosion in the amount of things you need to do in order to be successful with your integration strategy. But part of the problem then is how do you avoid it? Think about like this. How do you avoid getting into a position where you've got like every tool known to man, they're all in the mess, you don't really know how to structure things. And part of what like kind of we would advocate is you need an approach for making sure that you have all of the tools that you need, but you don't have too many, you don't have duplicates of them. And a way that we think that you can approach that is what we define as the hybrid integration capability framework. Now, this is part of the role of the ISET, is to build this kind of capability framework. This tells you, like, in which situation, what technology would you use? In this situation, what governance rules would apply, and so forth. So at its heart is understanding what technology you need. It's understanding yours likely with any organization have something which looks quite similar to this. You might not have all of these things, but you'll have needs for things like, I need to do event brokering. I need to do application integration. I need to do event-driven and request-driven communication. I need to do orchestration and so forth. And you would look at kind of, well, these are the sort of problems that we need to address. And then think about, well, how are you going to address them? Because the capability framework doesn't just consist of what are the things that we have and the things that we need. They also consist of, well, how do we approach governance? How do we approach operations? How do we deploy things and so on? And part of the model is to think about, well, how do I go about ensuring that I have the right technologies? And we recommend like a 4-step process for this. The first step is to think about what the actual use cases you have. What are the things that you are being asked to do that you need to do to deliver new integration and deliver new APIs? Or what do you do today? And also review like what current capabilities you have. Review what things you currently have and look at how closely those match and try and identify duplicates. Try and identify where you have the multiple technologies that do the same thing. But then critically align the technologies to the skills. Think about the people who are going to solve that particular problem and what sort of solution they need. I think this is like an iterative process. You have to constantly be doing this to ensure that your strategy is up to date and can deliver with each new initiative. So what we kind of think about with this approach is like you can build like effectively a table where you go, okay, we have this new project and it needs to do this type of integration with this use case with these endpoints. And you can build up this table, okay, this is all of the integrations and requirements we have. But you need to augment this with along the lines of who will build it, who will deploy it, who will manage it, because we're trying to move away from this view this is all done from a single centralized team. So think about what skills they have or what kind of technology they would use. And do you already have it or do you need to buy something new and think about where it would run and so forth. And with this approach, what you can end up with is building like kind of a matrix of, for this particular type of integration challenge, and for this team that we'll be building it, this is the product that we would recommend, or this is the way we would recommend coding it. And the ISET team can be responsible for defining kind of the rules of engagement, and then empowering those teams to go and build these things. So I've talked a little bit about, okay, this is the way that there's the challenges we're seeing with integration. I've talked a lot about integration and how we can introduce a new integration architecture. And throughout this kind of, so far, I've actually tied together the concepts of integration and APIs as if they're like a completely connected endeavor. But actually, another survey like that Gartner have done, where we look at companies who are very successful in terms of API strategy. And one of the key things, the key points you can pick up, if you look at like kind of their maturity as an organization, you know, the more mature an organization is in approaching APIs, the more likely it is that it has separated APIs into its own center of excellence or its own specialist platform team, separate to the integration team, separate to the integration strategy enablement team, separate to IT. And there's a number of reasons why this is the case. So if we think about like the first reason is If you think about what an integration team is really trying to focus on, it focuses on connectivity. How do I connect things together? How do I get things to communicate to each other? How do I get data to the right point? And the sort of people involved in that are people who are focused on solving that challenge. How do I connect things? You think about what APIs are trying to do. They're trying to expose APIs for reuse for the business and so forth. And yes, some of them may come from a requirement of, well, I use integration to expose that API, but they could actually come from anywhere. And really what we're trying to achieve when we're trying to be successful with APIs is not just focus on like the kind of plumbing of how we expose an API. It's really focused on what's our overall strategy for APIs? How are we going to create and manage APIs? And really it's along this point. It's like, if an API is something that you're looking to commercialize, that's looking to be successful with, you need to think about it as like a product that you're trying to sell. And therefore you need to apply kind of product management type thinking towards it. So it's like you've got to use the thought process of, you know, what's the market opportunity? What problem is the API trying to solve? Who's going to use it? What alternatives do they have? What else other APIs they could be? Thinking about things like, well, how are we going to measure success of this API? How are we going to decide whether this API is a success or a failure? And how do you refine the design and so forth? So all of these sort of things, these are all kind of product management skills and marketing skills and sales skills, which are separate kind of by definition from the integration skills that you see to be successful in the organization. So we strongly recommend that you set up in parallel with like an integration strategy management team. You also have a team to focus on APIs. It could be the same people, but it's like you have to think about these roles as different in order to be successful. In fact, we would go actually a bit beyond that kind of thought process as well, which is for exactly the same reasons that you don't want just like a centralized API team and a centralized integration team. You want to be more democratic about it. We actually recommended like a federated approach where you would have across kind of all different teams, you would have people who are responsible for the API strategy and so forth, who would come together and form the API platform team. So there's like kind of we're gathering APIs from anywhere we can within the organization in order to be successful in this market and space. And therefore, like you'll get a team which is driving the overall API strategy, but new APIs are coming from anywhere because that's how you're going to get the innovation that you need. So what I've tried to do over the last half hour or so is give an overview of what we're seeing in the integration and API market, some of the trends and some thoughts about how you can be successful, how you can be more successful in your approach. And really I wanted to kind of close on this point, is you need to think about basically what your integration approach is. And that's going to need to evolve because the business wants a greater flexibility and greater composability. It's likely that your integration approach is a bit stuck, it's a bit kind of dated. And you need to constantly evolve and understand the technology that's used and move from integration or move towards integration being something which is a business utility, which means that anybody can do it. Anybody can build integrations in a controlled way, but we've delegated it towards doing them. And the way that we think you can do this is by setting up a team that is focused on how to achieve that empowerment, how to achieve those things. So their real responsibility is to build this like hybrid capability framework, which is concerned with how do we address any integration need we have. And that's not just a one-off task. That needs to be constantly reviewed, constantly involved in order to ensure that it's still fit for purpose. And then my final kind of takeaway point is don't assume that API and API strategy just grows out of the integration team and becomes an integration responsibility, because then you're not going to get the benefits you want from APIs. All you're going to end up with is using APIs as a connectivity mechanism. You're just going to connect things together. You're not going to get the monetization of things because you're not thinking in the right way about how to be successful with APIs. So that's basically the things I wanted to discuss. There's my contact details here if anybody wants to contact me after that. I already have any questions?
Next stage.
You tell me that at the beginning. Okay, so the question is, how do you limit the risk of democratizing integrations from a security perspective? Yeah, so I think that what I sort of talked about was that you still have an integration platform team, And they're going to be responsible for addressing most of those kind of core security issues. So, how do you prevent dirty data? It's all about standards. You are going to find that by democratizing things, you're introducing more chaos. Introducing more people always adds to more chaos. And part of the way that you would address that is through governance. Now, governance is a bit of a dirty word, but that's part of what the ISEC team is trying to achieve, is enable things to happen without getting into these kinds of challenges going forward. No further questions? Yeah, lots of other questions. How is API product different as data as a product? Well, I mean, there's clearly similarities in that sense. What we're talking about as API as a product is this concept that APIs as a mechanism of providing something new that the business can monetize. So what they're trying to do there is they're going, well, we have this useful bit of functionality, which people would be interested in paying for. And it's not that they're paying for like kind of the whole thing. They're effectively paying for a building block. So if you think about things like Google Maps as an API that you embed into something that you want to be successful for, or if you think about like a hotel who have their own reservation system, exposing via APIs to some kind of centralized booking system like Expedia to enable them to book their own travel. It's a way of generating new business. So I think it is very similar to data as a product, but that's really what we're trying to achieve there. We bring all of these as a rule, but how do we train the rules to have that mindset? I'm not sure whether that's referring to the API mindset or the concept of like people should build their own integrations, but it's really about like if there's a culture in the organization which is really about increasing composability. So you saw like very early on, I had the quote from Bezos at Amazon about he adopted a very you shall do this or else you're all fired type mentality. I don't necessarily advocate that. I think part of the goal is like what I sort of alluded to on the API product team. Is you need to make the team feel that they're part of this and engaged in this, so they don't view like the ISET or the API platform team as a governance thing that is out to stop them doing things. They need to feel participants in that. How different are API platform, data platform, and application platform teams? Okay, where's that question? Okay. What is a better approach if you are alone? So I guess the question, what is a better approach if you are alone to API integration is, I think that part depends what do you mean by that? I think like APIs is also an approach to integration. So APIs as an approach to integration is that I am going to expose a series of APIs across all of my systems. And then if I want to solve any integration problem, I can do that by calling those APIs. So I can orchestrate those APIs, and that will build me a new system. And that's an approach to integration that works very successfully. Typically, we see that it doesn't work on its own because you then get into the mess of, well, I need to be able to do like event-driven integration. I need to be able to do like kind of data sync, ETL type things, which is not so good at. So I think that you can approach things that way, or you can think also that APIs is a mechanism for driving new business and a commercial model rather than just like an internal IT issue. In the Digital Integration Hub, we see events positioned as digital services. At the moment, only API gateways can solve security challenges. So I think that's referring to, in the chart, I had like a Digital Integration Hub, and I had a gateway, an API and event gateway. I think that was the point that it was trying to raise, which is talking to external systems. So one of the purposes of the Digital Integration Hub is to shield the backend systems. So the backend systems are filled in the Digital Integration Hub with new change data, probably using event architecture. But what we are seeing across the market is that API gateway vendors are adding support for asynchronous communication. So they're adding support for like async API, which is a mechanism of defining things like a Kafka topic as an API, and applying gateway policies to that. So I think it is definitely an emerging space, and not all of the vendors are using the same standards to address that. But we do see that increasingly and so forth. So I think I've got time for one more question, two more questions. Okay, there's been a long debate on API ownership in the organization, technical ownership and business ownership. Okay. I think that in order to be successful with APIs, and this is what I was really trying to talk about in terms of the product management approach. It's really a business challenge. It's like what you're trying to do is you're actually trying to build something that you're trying to commercialize. I was going to say sell, but it might not be sell. It might be you just want to get like new value from that. But really, it's like a business-owned thing because that's something that you're trying to deliver as something of value. So if it's a technically led thing, there's a risk really that this kind of gets underfunded. It's just seen as something that the IT team are doing to solve an integration challenge. So, okay, they're using APIs today, they're using web services last week, they're using file transfer before that. So if your goal is around, we want to take advantage of the API economy, we want to be the next Amazon, or we want to be the next kind of Google, and we actually want to make a huge amount of money out of APIs, or we want to be like kind of participating in things like open banking, we want to expose things in that way, it really needs to be business owned. It would be my guidance. But based on that's what we have seen people being more successful with is when it is a business owned thing. Okay, so I think I'll end on this question. What would be the top three things to do to grow my organization, integration and API maturity in the right way forward? So the first thing is to understand what it is that you're trying to achieve. Understand, what is the goal? Not everybody has the goal of increased composability. Not everybody has the goal of introducing like more democratization into the process. Other organizations are actually a bit more immature than that in the first place. So it really depends on where you're starting from as well. If you're currently in a state where you don't have any organization and integration is causing you a challenge, your best first step is actually to get more centralization and more control and introduce more policies around how you approach integration, because then you can evolve from that to a more democratized approach. Second point, I think, is around think about what you're trying to achieve. When you say APIs, it can mean a number of different things. I've touched on that point already. APIs could just be a technical mechanism for doing integration, or it could be something like I'm actually trying to achieve more for the business. I'm trying to sell more things. I'm trying to take the value of those things. If that's your goal for APIs, think about how you separate that from being a technical challenge. And I think the third final point I would say is the likelihood is, even if you're at the point where you're you have no approach to integration, so I'm saying first of all get to a centralized approach. Going forward, you're going to want to be more flexible. You're going to want to introduce more composability in the business. So you need to think about, do we have the right tools? Do we have the right governance processes? Do we have the right ability to enable more people to evolve and build integration? Because if that's key to having a flexible integration strategy going forward, is to constantly look at how you can improve your flexibility, how you can deliver more out of that, and therefore be more successful. Okay. Thank you very much.